Hello everybody. So it's been a little over 2 years since I did my last rack tour. So I figure, enough has changed that it's about time I give another rack tour and show what things look like in here in December 2022. Start here. First things first, the door now has some additional soundproofing on it. These outside ones are mostly for decoration, but as you'll see in a sec, I redid the soundproofing. So I'll get in here. Okay. First things first, the junk's been cleaned up, and I now have nice soundproofing all over the door here and the wall. Does make quite a big difference compared to egg cartons. And if I go back here towards the rack, the air conditioner's still the same. Still got this same 12,000 BTU air conditioner that does actually run all the time. So, it is what it is. It's just part of the power budget. We still got the intake from the outside, still got the outlet to the outside world, and we have this additional tube here that I added to, direct the heat more directly into the intake of the cold side, but the tube doesn't reach to where I need it to go, so it just kind of sits there up towards the top of the room to pull in the heat. So if I turn around to the rack itself here, it looks a bit more dense than it did before. So I'll go through it, from top to bottom here. So at the very top, I got some exhaust fans. So their purpose is just to take the hot air from inside the rack and move it out. As you'll see in a minute, or right here, I got rid of that old door with the fan wall and, made use of physics and gravity and heat rising to more efficiently move the heat out of the rack, and it does work a lot better. So, up at the top here, I've still got my patches. They've been rearranged a little bit from what I did before. You'll probably notice if you saw that other video, the red and the blue are gone. I no longer, use those connections. And I got a third WAN, but I haven't cabled it up, so theoretically there's two oranges here that are my WAN connections, and one of these is the WAN connection. I got my access points and my desk switch going, permanently in the green cables. Still the same access points I did before, the UAP ACLRs, and then the one UAP LR that, is, AC Pros, and then the one LR that does the home automation. Got, connections to my routers here, got all the management devices, so that's, pretty good. I upgraded the first switch here. So this is a new element here. Instead of that crazy D-Link switch that I had for 15 years or however long I had it, there's now a Quanta LB4M doing my 1 gig, still 48 port, but it's got 10 gig uplinks and a management connection and all that fun stuff here. Below it is still the same Quanta LB6M 10 gig switch that I had before. Aside from the new uplink connections, it's still doing its thing with all the 10 gig connections, 2 to each server. So that, gives me my high performance networking. So moving down, the two routers are still the same. They're still the HP DL360 G6s. I do have replacements for those coming. Been looking into those, 2.5 gig, 4 port, like cheap little firewall boxes that come from China. I have 2 of those on the way, so hopefully I'll be able to reduce my routers from about 200 watts down to like 20 watts. See how those go. So then going down, still have the Ceph cluster. So this still does, all of my bulk data. Still does, 3 servers with copies equals 2, dividing the data between them in such a way that I can lose a single host and not lose access to my data. I have changed the drive layout quite a bit. There's no longer labels, but I have one 14 terabyte in each one, and then the remaining 6 drives are all 8 terabytes. So that gives me, at this point, 186 terabytes of raw space, and I'm still, filling it up with all my Linux ISOs. So at some point, I'll replace all the drives with 14 terabytes. Now that I've, replaced all the 3s with 8s, I immediately turn around and replace all the 8s with 14s. But, it's still running swimmingly. At some point, I have a plan to actually redo this and, kind of set this up again using a not, 15 way of doing things, but it's not really a priority. So I realized in the last video I never actually hear specs on all these things, so I figure I'll do that now. So each of these 3 boxes has an Intel E3 1245V4 Ivy Bridge processor in it. So that's a 3 gigahertz, 4-core, 8-thread, low-end Xeon. But it does the job. It's in a Supermicro X9 motherboard, X9 SCLR motherboard with 32 gigs of RAM. So that's pretty good for, what they do. There's also a set of 200 gigabyte Intel DC S3700 SSDs that kind of act as, they're the system disks for one, and then they also act as write log for the ZFS file systems that are on each disk. They write as they act as the ZFS intent log, and they also act as the Ceph journal for each OSD. So that helps smooth out write performance to these spinning disks. And then, of course, for all this bulk data, I have CephFS on top, so it gives me a shared POSIX file system on top of this cluster. And as far as all my clients are aware, these 3 servers just appear as one volume that gets mounted with permissions for each, each service that does stuff on top of it. So moving down a bit more, the one without rack here is the 4th one here, is my backup server. So it's got the exact same specs as one of the Ceph servers here, the 1245 V4 and the 32 gigs of RAM. Actually, it might only have 16 gigs of RAM, I can't remember. But it's my primary backup. So I got 4 8TB drives in a RAID 5 there. And it does, all my VM backups plus synchronization of all the important data off the CephFS array. So my bulk media, I don't back up to here. Sorry, my bulk Linux ISOs, I should say. I don't back up to here. That is pretty much single instance for now until I set up replication to a friend of mine. But for the most part, anything important goes on this backup server, so I have, point-in-time backups every night and that sort of thing in case there's a problem. Below that, we got my Hypervisor cluster. So I did finally replace the last HP DL360 with an R430. I did that actually about a month ago. I'd been waiting to hopefully get, another one of the cluster for, let's just say, a reasonable price from a friend, and that never happened. So I ended up just buying one, spending, almost $1,000 on it to get it spec'd exactly like the other 2. But it's finally done, it's finally worth it. And I've noticed a performance improvement from actually having the 3 nodes be unified. So, what's in these guys? There's a single processor. So, I forget the exact model. It's an E5 2685 or 87, something like that, V4. So it's a 16-core, 2.2 gigahertz Broadwell era processor, which I find is absolutely plenty for what I'm doing with them, even with all the storage work that the cluster has to do and all the VMs that are on it. Somewhere around 50 VMs at this point. They're still plenty performant, and of course, because these R430s can take a second processor, but they don't by default, I'm able to actually, expand that in the future if needed. Each one's got 128 gigs of RAM, so a total of 384 for the entire cluster. And it's pretty much the perfect amount for what I'm doing. Pardon me. So system disks are 2 of the Intel DCS 3700 200 gigs. So they're really just for the system. Even though, there's a lot of wasted space for what I do with them. Oh well, they're consistent. And then I've got 2 800 gigabyte DCS 3700s. In each server, and those are actually the VM data. So I'll go into how that works in a second. But beyond that, inside of these, all of these servers have dual redundant power and all of that. They have 10 gig networking up to the 10 gig switch. So that ensures high performance data. So I mentioned it a few times in the last video, but I said PVC is what I run on these. And at the time I had the testing cluster up and I said, I'm running PVC. And I never I never explained what PVC was. So if you've ever used Nutanix or VMware's, whatever you call the cluster solution, vSphere, whatever, or you used Proxmox in some sort of like cluster configuration, that's what PVC is. So I kind of, in 2018, early 2018, I kind of hated all the options in that space. I wanted something free and open source and zero cost that would do host level redundancy by default and let me have a holistic unified cluster out of a set of servers and then just run VMs on top of it. So I wrote one, and it does a fantastic job. I've been using it in production here for, well, what is that, about 5 years now? 4 years now. And I use it at work for about 2 years now in production. So got something like 10 full clusters running in production out there in the world, running the software, and it works great. My lab continues to be the kind of, main testing instance of it. Just in case, I have a new feature that I'm working on or something like that, I deploy it here first to make sure it works. And basically what that lets me do is, handle all the VMs. Like if one of these servers were to go down, either intentionally for maintenance, I do a sudo shutdown on it, or if it were to, lock up, freeze, or die, the cluster manager takes care of, killing this node via its IPMI, making sure that the VMs start up on the other nodes, or, flush away cleanly and start up, live migration, all that sort of stuff. It watches what VMs are running, so if a VM crashes, it'll restart it. It makes sure the networking is consistent between all three servers, so if, I plumb a new VLAN into it, and I add it to the cluster, and it makes sure that all three nodes know about it. And the last main feature is really storage. So, I mentioned that I'm using Ceph on these 3 boxes for storage of bulk data in order to give host level redundancy. So within my PVC system, I also use Ceph. So these 800 gig drives here are in a Ceph cluster between these 3 nodes. So it's giving me basically shared storage using the Ceph RBD mechanism. So instead of a file system, it's giving me virtual block devices instead. And then I'm able to plumb those into VMs to make VM disks. And one of the beauties of this system and this setup is that, not only do I have disk level redundancy, if a disk fails, the other disk will take over from it, but it also gives me that host level redundancy. So if a whole host fails, I still have the data on other hosts. So it uses copies equals 3. Instead of copies equals 2, where it's like on these 2, or these 2, or these 2, this is copies equals 3. So every block of data is written to all 3 of them. So any 2 hosts are always able to access all of the data and still write to all of the data until the third comes back. So moving on from that, all my hypervisor, shenanigans, I have my base server. So in the last video, there was a Latte Panda. This was just a transcode server in my last video, and I had a Latte Panda Alpha sitting inside the rack. That was, my shell server, my base server. So at the time, I was loving that Latte Panda Alpha, but I did give some criticisms of it, specifically the fact that I got it from the factory defective and had to pay a shitload of money to ship it back. Well, that box lasted for another maybe 6 months, and then had another problem. Its Ethernet jack broke somehow, and the cord would just fall out of it. And it had to be sat in it in just the right way for it to have connectivity. And then even that stopped working. So I got rid of that box and was thoroughly annoyed. So at this point, my review of the Latte Panda Alpha is don't bother. Buy a different system. Buy something that's, far cheaper. But so I moved everything back to this 4U chassis, and it's now my shell box and my transcoding box. And it also now does Steam. I set up, or Steam Remote Play, I should say. But I'm not actually using Steam Remote Play. I've set up Sunshine, which is the server side, and Moonlight, which is the client side on my laptop, which is an open source implementation of NVIDIA's Game Stream protocol. Pardon me. So I run Steam on this, and I can play my games onto my laptop and actually have the full performance of the NVIDIA 1660 that's inside of there, and not, you know, heat up my laptop and have to worry about my battery power so much. So in this box is actually a better processor than anything else in here. It's actually similar to these guys here. It's an 8-core Broadwell era processor. I completely forget the exact model of that one, but it's only a single processor system, and it's got 64 gigs of RAM, which seems like overkill for a gaming machine, but A, I play City Skylines with a lot of mods, so I need it, and B, because of all the other stuff that it does, you know, not having to worry about, oh, how much memory are my, you know, 30 TMUX panes using up when I go to launch a game is very useful. So it's also got some SSD. It's got a bunch of NVMe SSDs in it. It's got 2 500 gig ADATA high performance NVMe drives in it. One's a boot drive, one's a, like, you know, home volume basically drive. So that gives me lots of performance there. And then of course that 8 terabyte backup drive is still around, and it's still plugged into here, but now it's tertiary backups. So, you know, I have all my main data that backs up every night to my secondary data, which keeps, you know, basically an infinite number of snapshots of my nightly data. I keep every day for 2 months, and then once monthly after that for pretty much as long as I possibly can. But then this backup drive only keeps last night's backups. So this is more of a, you know, complete disaster recovery if I ever had, like, well, a house fire wouldn't do me too well because I'd be in here, and a flood wouldn't do too well because it sits low in the rack. But, you know, in case there was ever some, like, serious systemic fault, I could grab this and go. And then going further down, this comes up a lot. I'm not going to get into my personal politics, but I got it off a Russian surplus Ushanka. I took it off the hat so I could wear the hat in public without getting weird looks. Stuck it on the server with super glue. It's been there ever since for 15 years. You know, let's not comment about that. Below that here we have my 3 testing hypervisors that are offline. I haven't used them in, you know, several months, and they waste power being plugged in, so I don't bother. They just kind of sit here. They're still the same, you know, G6s. And then last but not least, I still got my same 2 UPSs. I've done a battery change since my last video, so instead of only lasting about 5 to 10 minutes, they now last roughly their full 15 minutes that they're expected to at a little under 50% load. Actually, no, closer to 30 minutes at their current load. So, you know, that does a very good job of keeping my system up if there is some sort of, you know, power outage, which is relatively rare at my house, but happens just enough to be annoying and just enough to warrant, you know, having this sort of setup. Okay, so yeah, one more from, you know, top to bottom. Do that little sweep up and down here. Oops. Did not have a very good view there. But yeah, and if we shut off the light, lots and lots of blinking lights. Just how it should be. Alright, coming around the side, still got my sign. No one commented on this, but I found a old one next to a transformer station when I was much younger, and it was all faded, and I repainted it all because, you know, I love signs like this. So, Hydro 1 for the win. So, you can probably see already that I replaced that old, you know, horrible door that was just a 2x4 frame and stuff, and didn't have any sort of nice mechanism to hold it in place. So now it's just a thin piece of, you know, this veneer paneling I use with a handle on it, and it's got some hard drive magnets and some super glued washers that, you know, hold it closed, so it kind of snaps shut like that, and it's closed, and, you know, insulation around it to keep it closed. And it does actually mostly stay in position when I open it, but I've still got a SATA cable, only this time it's got a, falling over, holding it open. Only this time it's got a magnet on it, so that just kind of holds it open. And now we can see, you know, the inside of the rack. So So again, I'll flip on this light that I have in here that kind of just gives light for when I'm working in the rack. And quite a few changes in here from the last time as well. As you probably noticed, I did move the cables all down in order to make room for this hot air duct thing. So there's another 2 fans here that keep the hot air moving towards the front where those front fans exhaust it. Then of course I have the slightly uglier sweep now. Still same idea with cables coming out the back and cables coming down the sweep and distributing out to everything else. You know, back of the switches, back of the servers. This is all exactly the same as it was the last time. You know, I've got my compendium of 1 gig connections to the routers, CARP in between them, you know, like lights out management, main network connections there. These servers, you know, the Ceph nodes, the hypervisors all have, you know, their dual power, their lights out management, and then just dual 10 gig network connections. That's all they really need. Base is actually closed at this point, but it's got the same sort of setup with two 10 gig and then the management connection, and as I said, nothing's connected to the testing hypervisors. So along here, so ENV, short for environment, is still there, still ran away, but it's actually in a case now, and I significantly cleaned up a lot of the connections that go out to the temperature sensors. And I did end up losing 1 temperature sensor. There is no longer a bottom of the rack sensor. There's just this top of the rack and then the ones in the room. And the one that was on the door exhaust is now, you probably can't see it, but there it is back there. It's still exhaust, it's just at the front of the rack now. And one cool thing that I'm doing here with this Raspberry Pi is, you know, of course, one problem that I had with the way I had it run before is that if the whole rack lost power, I'd lose the environment monitoring too. So now there's this battery I got when I bought my last laptop. It's like a Lenovo just portable battery. So it runs, you know, it's got a Lenovo charger charging it, and then it's powering the Raspberry Pi. But this lets me get, you know, the Raspberry Pi still running for, I don't know exactly how long it lasts. The last time I checked, it lasted at least 30 minutes until I basically stopped caring. I'm like, okay, everything's off. But yeah, so that keeps the Raspberry Pi running even if the whole rack loses power. Got a nice little, you know, hub coming out where I still have the 2 UPS connections. And this actually here is a USB to Ethernet adapter. And what it's doing is monitoring a 3rd UPS that I have in the other room where my internet connections come in. So I'm actually monitoring the UPS for the internet connections too. This was not here before. This was take 2 of the fan arrangement. So take 1 was having them on the door. Take 2 was this, where I tried to make this channel that would go along the side of the rack towards the front. And it failed too. It just would not move enough air, especially given where it is in the rack. I thought, you know, having it right where the hot air comes out would help, but it didn't. So these are off and don't do anything. And then take 3 was using physics to keep the heat at the top of the rack and move it forward, and that seems to work better than all the other options. So the last kind of thing here, well, all of my access point powers are here. They should actually be attached to the wall, but they didn't stay. So I'll have to fix that at some point. Something better than, you know, 2-sided tape to mount them. But this is the last thing. So in the last video, I showed and talked a lot about my self-built PDU, which worked quite well, but I got dissatisfied with how it actually worked in terms of like what it was monitoring. It would only give me amperages, so I endeavored to build a 3rd version of my PDU, which would use a different, more advanced sensor, which could do current and real power and apparent power and voltage. And that took me like a solid 8 months to build. Slowly but surely, it cost a whole bunch of money. Get that out of the way. Cost a whole bunch of money. It looked really nice. I bought a 3D printer, a better 3D printer to 3D print parts for it. You know, it's this nice little open cage design made out of basically these like cover bits. Like, thing looked wonderful, but two big problems with it. First of all, I was still just unable to get the accuracy I wanted. Like, it seems all of these sensors, the Hall effect sensors and these ones I get, just require so much, like, calibration of, for lack of a better word, like, that doesn't really explain how complicated it is, but you have to calibrate each sensor over and over and over again and try 2 or 3 different types of loads to make sure it's calibrated for each load. And I got it mostly good, but ultimately I just wasn't happy with how accurate it was. You know, I'd be getting readings of, you know, tens of watts off compared to, say, what the actual, like, monitoring in one of the servers, like, these Dell servers tell me how much power they're supposed to be using, and the number they'd give would be wildly off from what the PDU would say. And then I learned a lesson about making sure you use UL rated parts. My inputs on PDU V3 just used an IEC power plug that, according to all the documentation of the part I got, was rated for 15 amps, which, okay, that's fine. Until it wasn't. It turns out it wasn't rated for 15 amps. It could only take 10 amps. And I found that out one day when one of them melted and fused its power switch on, wouldn't trip, and almost burned down my rack. If I hadn't noticed it in time, that would have been a disaster. So I said, screw it. I'm not taking any more chances with any of this crap anymore. Bought 4 nice power strip units. You know, fully, each one is actually UL 15 amp rated. Plugged everything in, and that's it. You know what? I don't need to monitor power on a per port basis whenever I've accepted that that's the case. So yeah, that's my rack at this point in time. So hopefully you found this interesting and enjoyable, and if you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them. Always willing to share what I do here, and remember, it's high voltage.